vote of Parliamentary Labour Party, supported by very few opposition party MPs. Probably the most important of any of these reforms in terms of its impact on the legislative process was the automatic timetabling or programming of legislation, which meant that each bill went through a pre-arranged timetable of debates. This had begun in 1997, but was made only permanent in 2004. The vote to make programming of government bills permanent saw not a single Liberal Democrat or Conservative MP vote in favour. This did little to weaken the suspicion that many of the reforms were not aimed at improving the scrutiny of government. Although many of the reforms made Parliament more efficient and several made it more open and accessible, it is possible to argue that few of the reforms did much to strengthen the capacity of the legislature to hold the executive to account. The authors of one study of the modern process argue that modernisation as efficiency has had more success than modernisation as scrutiny. Alex Brazier, 2005. In other words, the Commons has become more efficient at what it does, but has not necessarily become much stronger or more effective as a result. So a downside, a bit of a stillbirth to Parliament. The House of Lords. The House of Lords is one of the most misunderstood parts of the British Constitution and political system. It was Walter Bagehot in 1867 who wrote that the cure for the House of Lords is to go and look at it. And those who don't know about it in more recent history, especially those who cling to political orthodoxies learned 30 years ago, see it merely as one of Bagehot's dignified parts of the Constitution, a weak and feeble upper chamber, packed full of old men and a few old women who have good lunches and who frequently fall asleep whilst listening to debates, but have almost no impact on policy. Such a view has been exacerbated by the alleged packing of the upper house by Labour-supporting peers frequently described as Tony's cronies. Some of this critique is undoubtedly true. At 68, the average age of peers is high. Ironically, it got slightly higher as a result of the removal of the hereditary peers, since most of the hereditary peers were quite young. And it won't take an observer in the gallery of the House of Lords long to spot a peer who has fallen asleep during debate. Moreover, the process of House of Lords reforms was not Labour's finest hour in government. Consisted of compromise, followed by a hapless white paper, followed by a U-turn, followed by another U-turn, and by the end of Labour's period in government, apart from the removal of hereditary peers and the compromise to keep on 92 of them, nothing significant had taken place. Yet the somewhat botched debate on the House of Lords reform and the ongoing discussions of future options reform has tended to obscure the way the Lords are now actually functioning. The renaissance of the House of Lords can be dated back to the 1960s, following both the introduction of light peerages in 1958 and the failure of Labour's 1968 attempt to reform the upper chamber. As a result, peers began to attend the Lords more regularly, and the Lords began to behave in a more assertive way. From a chamber that had almost fallen into abeyance in the 1950s, the Lords now sits for longer than it ever did before, and in some years it sits for more days than during the year than does the Commons. Labour's partial reform of the House of Lords is also unusually being part of a more recent complaints about Parliament's marginalisation. By removing most of the hereditary peers, the government's critics argued was emasculating the one remaining check on the dominance of Parliament. For example, of the first 53 defeats the government suffered in the Lords after 1997, all but 6 occurred as a result of the votes of the hereditary peers. And so the argument went, remove the hereditary peers and you remove any effective opposition. In fact, as was clear within a year or two of the House of Lords Act 1999 coming into effect, and as a handful of people did point out, it was likely the exact opposite occurred. The House of Lords were not going to behave like performing poodles. The pre-reform House of Lords, conscious that its legitimacy was limited by the denying presence of so many hereditary peers, frequently practiced a self-denying ordinance, pulling back from many confrontations with the government. But with the hereditaries largely gone, those peers that remain have seen themselves as more legitimate and having more rights to be assertive than before. If the government hoped it had created a poodle of an upper chamber, then it was much mistaken. The full consequence of the reforms became increasingly clear during the second Blair term. The 2001-5 Parliament saw the government defeated on 245 separate occasions. This was more than double the number of defeats in the first Blair term. The comparison with the preceding Conservative governments was particularly stark. The average number of Lords defeats per session during the extended period of Conservative government between 79 and 97 was just over 13. These defeats range across almost every major piece of government legislation, and as the 2001 Parliament progressed, the Lords became more intransigent, less willing to give way, with the result that the sight of a bill pinging back and forth between Commons and Lords became commonplace at the end of the parliamentary session. This was most obvious during the passage of the Prevention of Terrorism Bill, just before the 2005 election, when the Lords resisted several clauses in the bill and it shuttled back and forth between the Lords and Commons for almost 29 hours. This, however, was merely the most high profile of a number of standoffs throughout that Parliament, such as over foundation hospitals, jury trials and the Pensions Bill. As we see now in the modern guise under the coalition under the Health and Welfare Bill, where it's been defeated on at least 12 occasions, and parts of it have been defeated. Of the two Houses of Parliament, therefore, it has been the Lords that has been more of a block on the government in recent years. Government ministers preparing legislation for its passage through Parliament knew that they faced a more serious test in the Lords than they did in the Commons, and ministers routinely resisted giving too many compromises whilst the bill was passing through the Commons in order to be able to offer placatory gestures to their lordships. The extra problems which the government faces in the Lords is sometimes ascribed to the greater wisdom of peers, their greater knowledge and their increased independence of thought. In fact, the parliamentary parties in the Lords are no less cohesive than those in the Commons. The difference, and this is a crucial one, is that in the Lords no one party holds a majority, despite Labour increasing its membership in the Lords throughout the Blair period. The government remains permanently in a minority, and this is true also of the coalition. In order to win votes in such a hung chamber, now something we can talk about almost in the House of Commons as well, the government needs to persuade at least one of the other party groupings to support it. And with so many crossbenchers, this becomes even more complicated. Indeed, in an irony not lost in members of the upper chamber, its composition currently better reflects the patterns of votes cast, certainly in the general elections in the 2005. The process of Lords reform since 1999 has thus created a more representative second chamber, one which is permanently hung and one which is willing to stand up to and regularly defeat the government of the day. There are signs that the Lords is becoming yet more assertive still. Shortly after the 2005 elections, the Liberal Democrats announced that they would be no longer supporting the Salisbury Convention. The convention dating back to 1947, which guarantees that the Lords will not block legislation promised in a government's election manifesto beyond second reading. The Liberal Democrats argued that when the Lords better represented the electorate than did the Commons, there was no longer any justification for the Commons automatically getting its way. Lord McNally, the Liberal Democrat leader in the Lords, seen here laughing and sharing a joke with Baroness Thatcher, described the continual plea to the Salisbury Convention as the last refuge of legislative scoundrels. Given that the Liberal Democrats frequently act as the swing voters in the Lords, determining government victory or defeat, this means that the government will face even more difficulties, though obviously that has now changed under the coalition situation. Even more significantly, when a Conservative government returns to power at Westminster, it will too face the permanently hung and increasingly assertive second chamber. No future Conservative government, or indeed coalition government, will inherit the overwhelmingly Conservative upper chamber of the past. There is still a legitimate debate about the extent to which the Lords should be elected, and one obviously that's been given to Nick Clegg to deal with, but still in process, and whether as a result the Lords should be yet more powerful. That dispute is one which has been fought out within the Labour Party over the last few years, between those who feared an upper chamber, which made it harder for Labour governments to enact its legislation, and those who wanted a more democratic composition, even if it made the Lords stronger, and as a result caused more problems for the government. That debate will continue over the next few years, especially under the new leadership, both in the Labour Party and indeed with the government under David Cameron and Nick Clegg. It has similarly been a debate within the Conservative Party. A Cameron leadership may well reopen this debate within its own party, only to find opposition within the party's ranks at Westminster. This debate should not obscure the fact that the Lords has in recent years become increasingly powerful and assertive, not less. Compared to, say, 50 years ago, the transformation is remarkable. Then the Lords had almost atrophied, fallen away, and Westminster was effectively a unicameral legislature. Now it is a system of asymmetric bicameralism, but one in which the weaker chamber has become increasingly strong and assertive over the last decade. Conclusion. Complaining about the weakness of Parliament is not necessarily a recent invention. It has rather been a popular participatory activity for at least the last 100 years, if not longer. Much of the criticism is valid. Parliament remains a marginal actor in the policy process. There has been a plethora of reports published in recent years which suggested reforms that would better enhance the ability of Parliament to stand up to the executive. Few of these proposed reforms have been introduced. The various reforms of the Commons since 1997 have modernised the institution and improved its efficiency, but they have done little, if anything, to strengthen Parliament in its key job of holding the executive to account. Even if one does not buy the arguments put forward by some of the more vehement critics of the process of modernisation, mostly, though not solely, Conservatives, that the process of modernisation reduced the ability of Commons to stand up to the government, it is hard to make a realistic case that it has strengthened it. Yet, by many other criteria, things are now much better than they used to be. MPs are now increasingly focused on the needs of their constituents, spending an amount of their time dealing with their constituents' needs which would have been unimaginable 50 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago. Although valued by constituents, this is not without its risks, of which the most serious is that MPs lose sight of their key role of holding the executive to account. Sorting out Mrs Miggins' pension may be laudable and rewarding to both Mrs Miggins and the MP, but it prevents proper scrutiny of forthcoming legislation on pensions reform, which will affect millions of Mr and Mrs Migginses in the future, and therefore is less useful. But despite the lack of any major positive internal reforms to the Commons, and despite the risks of MPs taking their eyes off the national picture, the Blair government, and particularly in the period 2001-5, did result in a partial rebirth of Parliament. Almost none of this was intentional on the part of the Blair government or of his immediate circle. The House of Lords Act 1999, for example, was not intended to result in the far more assertive body that it created, but it did. Similarly, it was not the wish of the government that its backbenchers, routinely dismissed as weak and feeble when they were first elected to government, should become increasingly rebellious during the second Blair term. But they did, and now we have a large number of Conservative backbench MPs, partly because they're in coalition with the Liberal Democrats, who they distrust and dislike, who are also highly rebellious. But they did, with the result that they now constitute one of Labour's leadership's most serious headaches, and a real impediment to the legislative programme that Tony Blair would like to enact in his remaining years as Prime Minister, and one's clearly that Gordon Brown was unable to enact, and the jury's out on what's happening to the Cameron-Clegg coalition. And we hope, Professor Cowley, that you enjoyed that.